In 1619, when the first Africans arrived in Virginia, religion and wealth, not physical appearance, defined status. Blackness and whiteness were not yet clear categories of identity.
They were more likely to distinguish between Christians and heathens than they were between people of color and people who were white. They regarded a person's status in life as somehow more fundamental than what color they were or what their particular background was.
The different ways in which those hierarchies of social class and social power became filled in with the content of race, so that the lowest class would be a black class and the highest class would be some particularly pale white class. That was a very gradual process.
For the first 50 years in the American colonies, most of the laborers were European indentured servants, many toiling on tobacco plantations in wretched conditions. With fewer Europeans braving the treacherous journey across the Atlantic, planters facing a potential labor shortage turned to the transatlantic slave trade and gradually replaced indentured servants with African slaves.
They found what they considered an endless labor supply. People who could be readily identified, and so when they ran away, they couldn't just meld into the population like Native Americans could. People who knew how to grow tobacco, people who knew how to grow rice. From their standpoint, the ideal labor source.
Colony by colony, new laws made slavery permanent and inheritable for black people. And for the first time, the word white, rather than Christian or Englishman, began appearing in colonial statutes.
To what extent you could say this was actually conscious strategy, or what extent it was the result of a number of unthinking decisions that resulted in this, but it did buttress a kind of social structure.
As African slavery increased, lower-class Europeans won new rights and opportunities. Some even became overseers and bounty hunters responsible for policing the growing slave population.
The ordinary white people are not going to be complicit in this system unless they get something out of it. My belief is that payoff was in a certain status, prestige, recognition, ego enhancement that ordinary white people could derive from racism. And so there was a kind of bargain struck.
Many of the European-descended poor whites began to identify themselves, if not directly with the rich whites, certainly with being white. And here you get the emergence of this idea of a white race as a way to distinguish themselves from those dark-skinned people who they associate with perpetual slavery.
Slavery became identified with Africans. Blackness and slavery went together. They gave the white American the idea that Africans were a different kind of people.
There's a racial divide emerging that people begin to see as natural, and that's part of where the idea of race comes from, is just in the tendency for people to see existing power relationships as having some sort of natural quality to them.
By the time Jefferson sat down to write Notes on the State of Virginia in 1781, a plantation economy dependent on slavery was deeply entrenched. Slavery had become so widespread that to many whites it seemed the natural state for black people. But when Jefferson turned his attention to Indians in Notes, what appeared natural about them was their status as a free people, brave warriors protecting their lands. This led Jefferson to suspect that Indians were not much different from Europeans.
Their vivacity and activity of mind is equal to ours in the same situation. We shall probably find that they are formed in mind, as well as in body, on the same module with the Homo sapiens europaeus.
The original view of the Indians was that they were naturally white people and they looked slightly brown because of exposure to the sun and because of the way they treated their skin. Jefferson felt that, among many people at that time, felt that the Indians were good human material, and the problem with them was not race but culture. That the Indians were savages, but they could be civilized.
Jefferson and his contemporaries were also influenced by European Enlightenment thinkers who believed that education and environment could improve people. But when Jefferson wrote about the Indians, he had little direct contact with them. Most Virginia tribes had